My name is Darren Sharp. I run the A Business branch of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Canberra. The purpose of today's video is to provide an update in relation to the policy changes on the Advisor Remuneration Framework. We did some reviews in 2019 and identified a number of unintended consequences associated with the ARF. Primarily, our reviews found the ARF restricted diversity in the profile of advisors working under DFAT ODA programs. It acted as a barrier to innovation in the delivery of the program. By specifying a box of terms and conditions, we limited the ability of the market to come up with creative solutions. It imposed restrictions on who can work with us with arbitrary requirements on years of service. For example, this did not allow contracting companies to bring graduates into the Australian Aid program. It limited the ability of contractors to engage local staff or suggest particular compositions of a team. It constrained non-traditional delivery arrangements such as fly-in, fly-out models, and it made it difficult to attract the level of expertise required to deliver on government priorities, particularly areas of communications, water, transport and infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific. We have some intended outcomes as a result of these reforms. The Australian Government has decided to remove the framework to drive the best value for money outcomes, increase diversity in the labour market, both suppliers and individual contractors, help deliver better solutions for the delivery of Australian aid and development cooperation. The best outcomes require smart solutions and the right people to work with us. We want more women involved in the delivery of the development assistance, particularly in leadership roles. We want talented young professionals involved. We want more involvement by Indigenous Australian businesses. We want greater local involvement in the delivery of development assistance. This includes growing local capability and creating jobs and opportunities for our emerging leaders in partner countries. We want the technical expertise to deliver a modern and progressive development assistance program focused on the Indo-Pacific. Our reforms provide the incentive for those wanting to work with us to demonstrate a commitment to diverse, cost-effective and creative aid programs. Policy parameters. From 1 March 2020, ARF conditions will not apply. Tender documentations released last week did not include ARF requirements. DFAT will not agree to salary variations to current contracts or amendments. This includes existing panel arrangements and extension options. The reasons are clear. Current contracts were tendered under ARF terms and conditions. Our review suggested that companies may not have bid on existing programs due to the limitations of the ARF. To remove those conditions mid-contract would be a breach of the spirit of the procurement rules. Importantly, we have contractual arrangements with our current contractors and we expect these to be honoured. Salary rates. Tenderers are now required to provide salary rates for staff. Salary rates should reflect a base rate and separately any additional rates that apply to the project tendered, for example, location allowances. Salary rates will be considered as part of the evaluation process and subject to contract negotiations. We expect tenderers to justify salary rates for particular skill sets. DFAT is collecting information from various domestic and international sources to assess rates provided to us in the tender process. This allows a genuine like-for-like for the professional skills and baseline salaries of staff included in a proposed tender bid. Class of travel. The default class of travel will be economy class unless there is a legislative requirement or compelling circumstances requiring business class. Short-term accommodation and travelling allowance. We will use the United Nations rates for short-term travel and rates. Non-salary conditions. These are not included in the commercial offer and not considered as part of tender evaluations. After identifying the right personnel to undertake the work at a right price, there will be factors we will need to work through in contract negotiations. These are not considered as part of the commercial assessment. We will not be looking to drive down costs in these areas, but we will need evidence that the costs are appropriate. For example, housing. We expect tenderers to identify reasonable housing costs associated with deployed staff. DFAT will not provide any guidance, but will undertake checks to ensure housing standards are appropriate. We expect that housing is based on family composition and not level. Education provisions. We do not require details of education costs for dependent children included in the tender documentation. Payment of fees will be formalised as part of the contract startup and administration phase. There is no limit on the number of eligible dependent children. Special adjustments. We do not require details of special adjustment costs for contractors or their dependents included in the tender documentation. This would include things like people with a disability. Payment of special adjustment costs will be formalised in the contract startup and administration phase. Leave. DFAT will not get involved in the conditions such as setting leave. It is up to employers and their employees on how they manage issues such as leave. This principle applies to maternity or paternity leave. We will not be prescribing conditions around maternity leave. We are open to a discussion on a case-by-case basis around reasonable adjustments, and this will be done under the same principles that apply to non-salary conditions. That is, we don't want to create an environment that disadvantages families. Reporting. Managing contractors will be required to report on salaries and support costs through a new Performs database. Reporting on Performs will be a contractual obligation. We'll provide further information on Performs in the near future, including a baseline exercise we'll need to complete in the next few months. Please note that Performs will replace some of the current reporting requirements, such as the advisor stocktake. We have inbuilt review periods for the implementation of the new policy to check whether we are meeting our objectives on diversity, innovation and effectiveness. Performs is the primary tool which we will rely on for this analysis. As we have flagged through the IDCC, we'll be undertaking a broader range of design and procurement reforms to enable a flexible, adaptive and modern aid delivery program. We will continue to work through the IDCC over the course of this year on these reforms. I have some specific questions which I'll now address. There was a concern that not allowing variations or escalators to existing contracts may continue to disadvantage staff on existing contracts. We will not be considering variations to existing contracts, and this includes escalators. The objective of the reforms is to remove barriers for participation from a number of groups, including women, contractors with families and local staff. All new tenders remove those barriers. Individual contractors and managing contractors signed up to the terms and conditions on offer at the time of a contract, and we expect those conditions to be met. Management fees. The question of management fees is something we're looking at as part of our broader reform agenda. No decision has been made on this. Is there a distinction for locally engaged personnel? No. Do we see risks in attracting women and families through the removal of the ARF? No. We believe the removal of the ARF will encourage more women and contractors with families to participate in the delivery of the Australian Aid Program. Is DFAT considering recommending removal of Section 23G of the Income Tax Assessment Act? No, we will not be doing that. How will we mitigate bidding wars? The purpose of the reforms is to broaden the contractor base. We anticipate that removal of the ARF will attract new entrants to the market and alleviate reliance on a small number of sectoral experts. Concerns about contractor drift from ARF contracts to non-ARF contract. The first point is there an inbuilt assumption in this concern that we are paying more, or we will pay more for similar services already delivered on our programs. This is not what these reforms are about. This is about removing barriers and encouraging a more competitive environment. We note that all procurements are subject to a competitive process on salaries and part of an evaluation process in any event. The Dev Panel. There's been a question as to whether the Dev Panel is subject to ARF or non-ARF rates. The Dev Panel Amendment number 3 in the RFT clearly stated that if the ARF would change, that would be reflected in the deeds at the time. So in this particular case, Dev Panel is not subject to ARF rates.